Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Donna Conwell.
And my name is Kelly Sicat, and we're your hosts of Scratch Space.
Scratch Space is a virtual forum hosted by the LucasArts Residency program at Montalvo Arts Center, which is located in Saratoga, California, on the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people. With Scratch Space, we are bringing together visual artists, scholars, composers, activists, writers, and others to explore what kinds of radical imaginaries can unfold in this moment of pandemic, racial reckoning, economic uncertainty, unrest, and environmental crisis.
We're interested in how we think about what is possible, how we can use our imaginations to build a better present and future, and how we can retool and create better and more equitable models for living and working together. So tell us about our guests today, Donna.
Well, today we are joined by two amazing artists, LEAH Rosenberg and Christine Wong Yap. LEAH is a San Francisco-based artist who explores the emotional and psychological impact of color in painting, sculpture, printmaking, food, and performance. Her mural, Everywhere a Color, can be found in the International Terminal at SFO Airport. LEAH was the creative director for Color Factory, which is an experimental art exhibit inspired by the joy of color in San Francisco in 2017 and in New York City in 2018. Her book, The Color Collector's Handbook, came out in 2018. And she also illustrated the book, Get Out of My Head, Inspiration for Overthinkers in an Anxious World, which was released in May 2020. So perfect timing for that book. Christine uses social practice, drawing, printmaking, and publishing to explore dimensions of psychological well-being, such as belonging, interdependence, and collaboration. She often partners with organizations to conduct participatory research projects, whose outcomes include site-specific public artworks, zines, and books. She's currently a Lower Manhattan Cultural Council Workspace Artist in Residence, and she was also the inaugural Artist in Residence at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. Christine is a long-term resident of the San Francisco Bay Area, but she's lived and worked in Queens, New York since 2010. I'm really excited today to talk to LEAH and Christine about their current work and projects and their shared interest in psychological well-being at a time when we're living through such a period of great social anxiety and discord.
I'm really excited to have LEAH and Christine with us today. You'll find their links are in the chat to their full bios. And I want to give a shout out to Nathan Zanon, who is behind the scenes taking care of us, our producer for Scratch Space. I'm going to leave the screen now and leave Donna with Christine and LEAH, and I'll be back in about 45 minutes or so, where we can take any questions from our viewers. See you soon.
We'll see you soon. So we'll just wait for Christine and LEAH to rejoin us here.
Hello.
Hi, Christine.
Hi, Donna.
Hi, LEAH.
Hey, LEAH.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I wonder if you could tell us where you're coming to us today, Christine.
Well, I think if you can hear the siren, you might have a guess. I'm in New York City. I'm actually at my studio at the Lower Manhattan Culture Center's Workspace Artist in Residence program. It's been a huge honor to be in residence here, and I'm really glad to have this space. I'm really close actually to Wall Street, and Trinity Church is right behind me.
Wow. And you're going to be taking us on a little tour of your studio and the work that you've been making a bit later in our conversation. So I'm excited for that. And what about you, LEAH? Where do we find you today?
I'm in my home studio in Bernal Heights in San Francisco. And yeah, I have a piece from Christine and a piece from Susan in my studio. So that keeps me accountable and company.
That's lovely. Well, I'm so thrilled to have this opportunity to speak to you both. And as a bit of background for our audience, it might be helpful to just explain that Christine and Leah and I first worked together in 2013 on an exhibition called Happiness Is, which was staged in Montalvo's Project Space Gallery. And it launched a kind of multi-year thematic program we organized exploring well-being. And the exhibition included existing and new work, all exploring what is happiness and how do we achieve it. And the exhibition itself was a collaboration between Christine and Leah and a wonderful friend, artist and curator, Susan O'Malley. Susan passed away very unexpectedly in 2015. Today is her birthday. We'd like to acknowledge the profound impact she had on our lives and the way her work lives on today. And Leah and Christine, if you would like to say a few words, we start our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I designed this billboard, and the question is like, how do you keep your heart open? And I think this title of how do we keep our hearts open is borrowed from that, and it's all going back to Susan and what I learned from her as a person and as an artist and as a social practitioner. So yeah, I think a lot about Susan in my work, and she gives me a lot of courage to be vulnerable and to continue making my work.
Yeah, and I think just echoing what Christine said is, I think with like the collaborative ways that the three of us have worked and almost continue to work together fosters this kind of healing sort of component to artwork. And I think that's in large part due to like, you know, how it feels to be around someone and the sort of the art that they put out into the world, but also who they are as thinkers and kind people. But I think both Christine and Susan, for me, never stop asking questions. And I think that through their work, it's never sort of telling you what it is. It's bringing in things that feel like they need to be expressed and honored. And so I think the whole, you know, Christine's billboard is a perfect example of putting a question out into the world and having that be something that people take with them to think about and sort of impact their lives in that way. And Susan too, I think, was always really starting a conversation by asking questions and almost like ending it too. But yeah.
Yeah, well, it's lovely to also see her poster, as she says, in your backdrop, reminding us love is everywhere, look for it. And I have the same poster above my desktop, and it's a, you know, it is a real constant reminder to live that way with intention in your life. So thank you, and I'm sure we will be talking more about Susan as we go through the conversation. I'm really excited to speak to you both today about your work and the questions it raises about how we can cultivate a sense of well-being. And that seems so relevant at this time. I mean, like the coronavirus, it's not really been like a single disaster event. It's been this like prolonged period of stress and uncertainty. And simultaneously, we're facing this deep sense of like social discord and distrust and anxiety associated with our very divisive political landscape. And then also, you know, we've been thinking a lot about the interplay between self-care and community care. Like, how do we take care of ourselves, but how do we also do acts of care that benefit others, whether that's protesting for other people's rights or, you know, small acts of compassion and kindness. And I think one of the things I find so interesting about your work is this interplay between those modes of self-care and community care. We were just talking before we went live about how creatively active you've both been during this time. It's kind of really inspiring. But I'd love us to start by looking at 2 large-scale public works you created during this time that have kind of actively engaged the medical community. And I'm wondering if we could start with you, Christine, and your billboard project. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your commitment. And I'm going to, as I kind of pull up the PowerPoint to share some images, maybe you can tell us a bit about how the project came to be and why was this an important project for you to take on?
Yeah, thank you. So I just also want to say, because I'm in a studio where it's an open studio, and there's other artists here, I have to keep my mask on, so I'm sorry if anybody out there is a lip reader. Sorry about that. Okay, so this project I was invited by Times Square Arts and For Freedoms to contribute to their project called Messages for the City. And it was to express messages of gratitude to essential workers. This was very early in the pandemic, in I think April. And I wanted to honor medical workers. And these are portraits of real New York City medical workers. So this is Sherry Singleton and Crystal Cadet. They're FDNY paramedics. They both actually in the line of duty contracted COVID, and they're both recovering, and I think Sherry is back at work. I think, you know, the idea that this disease is not real, I just can't imagine how hard it is to be a healthcare worker on the front lines, to be someone who runs towards danger while the rest of us runs away, and to feel gaslighted by leaders to say that your experience isn't real, what you're seeing on your job isn't real. I just can't imagine what that's like. So, I think we can show the next slide. This is a bunch of nurses from public hospital in the Bronx. The New York City public hospital system is the largest public hospital system in the country. And as you know, early on, New York City was one of the epicenters. And within New York City, the epicenter of the epicenter was in Queens and the Bronx, which are predominantly Black and brown, working class, low income neighborhoods. So the woman in the center is Kelly Cabrera, sorry about that. She is a nurse and she's also a union rep, and she was really vocal as an advocate for getting more PPE. And then the woman on the right is Elsie Rios. Next slide. So there's one more artwork. This one, it's funny, we could submit artworks, and then the billboards chose the ones that they want to show, and I mean the billboard companies, and they didn't pick this one, and I understand the tone of this one is a little bit different, but I think the kind of fear and intensity that I was feeling in April is, I feel again we're in this moment of another spike, and it is really important for people to do their part and wear a mask. So the doctor here is actually an emergency room doctor in Queens. And for me, I also just wanted to make sure to include an Asian face because as we saw incidences of anti-Asian violence happening, it was just important to recognize all sorts of people are making sacrifices right now. This doctor actually moved out of his house so he wouldn't endanger his 1-year-old baby and wife. And it's if just wearing a mask is uncomfortable and hot, it's what is that kind of sacrifice in comparison to what other people are doing and have been doing every day?
Yes, it's such important work. I mean, how have the the medical workers that you based these posters on and their other colleagues responded to this work? I mean, it's you kind of mentioned this, but there does seem to have been like a bit of a shift that's happened from like early on in the pandemic when you know, healthcare workers were really being spoken about as sort of heroes, and that as it's kind of gone on, and that's sort of taken its toll. The time, you know, the time has passed, that sort of attitude has shifted a bit, and so I was just wondering how they've responded to seeing this work.
Yeah, you know, I think when this work first went up, it was so early in the pandemic. I really tried not to bother them. Like, you know, these doctors and nurses were working these super long shifts with like inadequate PPE. And I just tried to keep my interactions with them really brief and just give them a lot of space. Sherry had spoke about how important like the recognition was for her. You know, paramedics in comparison to firefighters don't make as much money, and Sherry and Crystal have been like speaking out about that, and I think recognizing like they're on the front lines too, and there are dangers that they are also facing, and let's see, I think Sherry also mentioned something that was really meaningful for me. She's like, just recognizing like colorism in media representation, and that people of her skin tone aren't often represented. So she was, it was nice to hear that she felt represented by my artwork.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that it sort of struck me seeing this work is that you don't often see gratitude expressed this publicly and at this scale in our society. And I know you've sort of been in your wider practice, you know, you've been thinking about gratitude, and I'm wondering whether you were also thinking about it in a kind of broader sense with this piece.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think for me, like I've been interested in positive psychology and subjective well-being for a long time, but when I first started researching, I was like, oh, maybe this is really navel-gazy. Maybe like me just wanting to know more about my own internal experience is very selfish, but there's no aspect of psychology that doesn't connect to other people. Like in the end, it's really about connectedness, and one way you can practice connectedness is through gratitude, and it's such a simple way. And I think something you mentioned earlier, Donna, was about kind of like, I think it was like between the idea of like liberty and like responsibility, or like self-care and community care. And you know, in this time, there's not much that any of us can do, but at the same time, like if all we can do is lighten the burden, or like make it easier for people who are tasked with the most dangerous jobs to like have less cases to deal with, then let's do it, you know. That is a form of community care.
Yeah. Thank you. So let's turn now to you, Leah, and your project, Like a Multivitamin. Oh, sorry, there we go. Like a Multivitamin, and this is an installation you completed in early October at Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, which was a collaboration between SV Curate's Montalvo Arts Center and Valley Medical Center Foundation. And it was a project that began before COVID, but sort of took on this kind of greater meaning and urgency as we moved into 2020. So can you describe this work for us and its audiences or constituents?
Yes, thank you. This was, you know, I think like a lot of my projects start with color and thinking about the people who will be either interacting with it or experiencing it, but also really ensuring that I'm not just coming in and that there's almost like a collaboration with the architecture too. And it was important to me, and there was a few spaces, opportunities to sort of add color or sort of make what is maybe considered colder architecture into something a little more welcoming and inviting. But I wanted to make sure, to just understand where you are. I mean, there are people who are, as the women and children's labor and delivery department, there would be people, I wouldn't even imagine what they were going through, from sorrow to celebration. And then also the people who are doing the cleaning right now, and the medical care, and how many languages are spoken amidst all of the staff and people coming and going. I think I use color because I'm drawn to it, and for the stories that can emerge when people encounter it from wherever they're coming from, or whatever language they speak. And so color, I find, is just a really universal language. And I think I wanted it to be an installation where it could be taken in from a lot of different vantage points. So, this is on the 3rd floor outdoor courtyard. When you're on the 4th floor, you can look down and get something out of it, and you can go and actually, walk around the whole installation if you're outside, and take in all the colors. And I call kind of referring to it as a chromatic meandering. So there's not really a beginning or an end. And so the colors end up being sort of like a story altogether, or they can be a moment for coming to attention if you focus on a single one. And the incorporation, I think, of haiku, I have said, like, I think it gets a little bit of a bad rap sometimes in terms of poetry, but for me, I use it really specifically because it's a structured, succinct form that sort of traditionally describes a particular moment in time that is from the natural world or a season, and brings you to attention, takes away all of the superfluous words, and really describes the moment. And I feel like that's, in a sense, what I try to do with color, is just bring people into a moment. So there are a few of the colors along the way that have corresponding haiku as well.
There's an example of one for us to see. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to sort of imagine looking at this image, like how what this space was like before, but it was so incredibly unwelcoming, even though it was sort of designed as kind of natural gathering space for families. But it was just very unwelcoming before, your intervention. And I know we've heard from staff and visitors, and their response has been, really positive, that this is a space that really feels like a sanctuary, and is especially needed now when there's just so much strain psychologically and physically to healthcare workers and patients. But I'd love to go more into talking with you a little bit about, that the use of the haiku, the use of color, as you talked about, giving visitors this opportunity to have views from different perspectives, but also to take in the installation as a whole, but also focus in attention onto one color and one moment. And I'm thinking about that as a sort of mindfulness practice, and the haiku is the mindfulness practice. And I want to ask you about the role of mindfulness in your thinking and work, both this project, but also other work that you've been developing during this pandemic moment?
I think, you know, in the spirit of asking questions, I guess my work has also been motivated by this question of what it means to make something for someone, and is it possible to make a generous artwork, or to have generosity at the core, and how do you communicate that? And I used to think it was through giving something away or including all the colors. And I think as time has gone on and the projects maybe become larger, or there's more, you know, I think when you think maybe too much of audience, I mean, I'm thinking of Christine with Times Square. How do you think of every person who's going to encounter that piece? Sometimes I think it would harbor any or get in the way of any progress. You know, like it might stop you from actually getting anything done. And I think for me, I got to a point where I think there was this element, or even like expectation became a medium almost, and I was doing work based on what was expected of me and of fulfilling this question of generosity. And I really had to reconsider what that meant, not just because of this current time, but because it was starting to take a toll on me, the person who's making it. And I thought, well, how do you keep making work that's about this if you are not figuring out how to be generous to oneself? And I think if you turn inward and deal with that question, then it's going to translate out into the work that you make. And I think, you know, what Christine was saying about, is it navel gazing and is this selfish? I think that crosses my mind all the time of like, you know, even in my selection of color, is this just coming from a place where I like these colors together, or is it really coming from a place where I feel like they have the potential to do more together in this place particularly? And I think too, it's up to me to start to trust that they are generous on their own, and that maybe the incorporation of language or actually keeping it a bit more open is the generous thing to do, and to not tell people how to engage with it, but listen to how they are engaging with it.
Mm. Yeah, that's so interesting to see the evolution of your thinking about that. So can you tell us about this image here, the Color Council project that you've been working on during your time sheltering at home in the pandemic?
Yeah, so this image is actually from a project in Omaha that was called Chromaha, and it was 100 days of color. And I would go through these residencies. I get a lot out of being in a new place, but I also go with a predetermined sort of a plan of recording my time there daily through a color I encounter. And that really allows me to, or allowed me when I could travel freely to all of these residencies, and to immediately, the moment I got there, I could start sort of engaging with the place and learning about it, and also having conversations with the community. It sort of gave me a platform to ask more questions about landmarks and foods in season. And so I'd really try to capture the place that I'd never been in, like a almost like a map or a landscape painting through these daily colors. And I would try to kind of show all aspects of the city. And so that is a moment, and then I would name it, retitle the color. And so at the end, you have almost what's like a 100-line poem. So that is the green. And then that was kind of the thinking behind Color Council when we had Shelter in Place was announced. And there was, you know, so much of what these color collecting expeditions are my presence, and just thinking, just like me going out and finding the color or experiencing the place and pulling the color. And how do you do that when you're, you know, how do you like sort of transcend the screen to get to that place or to take someone there? And so I started color collecting in my house, and each week did a Color Council, which was meant to sort of be, again, a focus on a single color, and thinking how mindful one could be by actually seeing the color in all of in their quarters, which it could be the clothes they wear, the food that's in their fridge, what's outside their window, the books on their shelves. And I was surprised even myself at how much color I live with, because I do use it all the time in my work, but I don't necessarily, it's not all in my, it's not a colorful closet or anything, but so I would gather all of the colors, and then we would do a meditation on that color, in which we would fill a page with that color with marks, and for 1 minute do a mark, and then do a breathing exercise, and then again a minute, and fill the page with that color. And the idea behind that was just to make something without judging it. I think sometimes I get in my own way, and before I have even started to put the pen to paper, I've already decided it's not good. And so I just wanted to get people going. And then in the end, you start to see what this breathing exercise that's meant to sort of calm you or relax you, what impact that has on the marks that you are making. And so it did feel like we were all in that color together, I think, even though we were on screen. And it was a nice sort of, I think sometimes I feel like I turn to color like people go to church or do their, you know, ritual. And this Friday morning routine was really one that that I started to almost rely on during the beginning of Shelter in Place. So
that's amazing. And then you've also been creating these short videos in black and white, interestingly enough, so getting rid of any color. And can you tell us a little bit about what you were thinking there?
Yes, again, being at home and just thinking about all the media, you know, that I really almost had everything I needed, and that by going away, we're coming and going so frequently for residencies and projects, I recognized how much I was missing when I was gone. And I think that, you know, pastry and baking, particularly cake, has been a big part of my practice, in this also idea of making things like how it can be a vessel for meaning, but also how you can offer it to someone and it gets eaten or it's gone, whereas art is often left for constant judgment. And so, and I think this was around June when, you know, it was becoming a lot more clear that I was not aware of a lot of things that I needed to be aware of, and just really disheartened by everything happening, as I think we all were. And I just didn't know if there was room for color. I almost felt like it wasn't appropriate or it was this too delightful. And I just felt it was like a somber time, and I wanted to see if I could get more to an answer or a point or a reasons without it, and still tell a story. But I also think that, you know, I think both Christine and I have been reading some of Ross Gay's writing on delight, and other people do write about that, but I'm particularly taking with his writing right now. And there has to be an element of joy and humor throughout all of this in order to get through. And I was also trying that, and without words, and so it's just these actions that turned out to be sort of like these silent films that I would put to music, and trying to do two things at once, or things I usually do. But yeah, anyway, they're sort of, I felt amused doing them and I needed that. And I think in the spirit of vulnerability, I stayed in my pajamas and made these from home, and who knows? I don't know. I never imagined them really to be in a panel discussion.
Yeah. Well, you know, we'll talk more about cake in your practice a bit later. But, you know, it's interesting because so many people took on baking during the pandemic. And it really was like, it's another one of these places where it becomes like an act of self-care in a way, this sort of ritual of baking. But in your work, which we'll talk about later on, it also has the social care dimension, because you're making cakes as a way of caring for others. And so I hope we can talk a little bit about that soon. I'd like to turn to back to Christine now, if I could. You know, thinking about your work during this time, thinking about resilience, and, you know, obviously mindfulness is a way of building resilience, but you have just, I'm not quite sure when this show opened, but you have this show on at the Michael Kohler Art Center called Between You and Me, which is presenting some of, I think, some existing and new work. And just wondering if you could talk us through this exhibition, and then maybe we can do a little tour of the studio with you and see the work that you're developing there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so this is Between You and Me. It's curated by Shannon Ray Stratton at the John Michael Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. It's supposed to open in March. I think it actually opened to the public in August, and it'll be on through February 2021. And Shannon's concept for this show is to bring together artists whose practices involve some level of community care. And a lot of the artists, I think you could say that they are social practitioners. There's probably like 6 or 7 artist groups, and myself, and this is my area. Yeah, I think there's a detail on the next slide of one of the projects, and it's actually a collaboration with LEAH that I did when we were fellows at Colorism Art Institute in Berkeley. So this is part of a project I did called Ways and Means, and it's a series of activity kits inviting people to do letterpress printed activity sheets to kind of get them thinking about things like connection, agency, and interdependence. So the one I collaborated with LEAH on is this one. It's called Colored Cootie Feeling Catcher. So it's a 13 color wood block letterpress and polymer plate print. It's perforated in this tear away pad. So you can actually tear away the page and then tear away the square part and then fold it up into that little thing that you can play as a game with someone. And someone picks a color and they pick another color, and then they end up with a question. And the idea is to have a dialogue. So I'll just read out the questions because it's a super light gray. One of the questions is, how do you create a feeling of belonging? How is your courage? That's a question I borrowed from Jaime Cortez on the Congratulations Pine Tree podcast. How do you know when you're on the right track, and how are you supported? These are all questions about kind of like deepening conversation. Yeah, I don't know if there's another slide or I should go to my studio.
Yeah, let's go to your studio now.
Okay.
Stop the sharing.
Great. So let me just do a little pivot over here. So I have been researching resilience, and this is kind of this big wall behind me of, it's all notes all about like different positive psychologists who have been written about like different aspects, and I was trying to like identify what resilience is, what it means, how it relates to different things like optimism, grit. Does it always have to come out of adversity? Can you have resilience without adversity? What does that look like? How does it relate to belonging? So there's notes from different books that I've read by people like Angela Duckworth, Brene Brown, Martin Seligman, Shane Lopez. And then I actually realized that there is a really great book about resilience. Let me kind of scoot back. I'm in a fake dolly, baby legs. I'm in a like rolling chair. So these are plotter prints of graphite drawings that I made because I'm blowing up the drawings because I drew them small and I realized like I want to make them big. And this is like one of the frameworks in this book by Karen Rivich and Andrew Chate called The Resilience Factor. So this is like 7 abilities of resilience. And there's 7 skills of resilience and 4 fundamental uses of resilience. And then the actual drawings are kind of smaller. I'll grab one of those. They're like 9 by 12. And then, so I'm breaking down like each of the like 4 or 7, whatever things into like smaller colored pencil and paper drawings that kind of define each dimension or element. And then these are flags that I've been sewing that are part of they're part of a project I'm doing called How I Keep Looking Up. And it's a participatory project with the Kohler Art Center where I'm inviting the public to submit flag designs that represent their sources of resilience. And then I'm also inviting volunteers to help sew flags as well. And then these will be exhibited at the Art Center. So if I can just talk some through the one that's kind of fluorescent yellow, that's my flag design. It's, you know, hanging vertically right now just because I don't have enough room in my studio. But that one represents 3 good things, which is a writing and reflection exercise. It's a gratitude kind of journaling exercise because that's really helped me. This one is by Betsy, and it's got some waves and a cross that's important for her resilience. We also got some great submissions from middle school students. I think this one is by, I want to say Elizabeth Kaufman, I'll have to check. And she's 13 years old, and the upper corner is broken glass, which represents all the things in life that push you down. And then the purple, pink, and yellow represent stages of like recovering. So like kind of like going from the bottom and like things are tough into like finally overcoming. And then this one is like Kat, and she, it's hard to see, but there's like wheat berries in there. She's a baker, and for her, like baking has been a thing that she does that also connects her with her Sicilian heritage. So yeah.
What is it about flags that's interesting to you, Christine?
Oh, yeah. So I did, and the Happiness Is show, I did some flags, and for me, that was like a lot of fun because it's a way to trick people to look up, like literally looking up. And there's a book by Mark Johnson, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but it's called Metaphors We Live By. And it's all about like how humans naturally understand abstract concepts in terms of concrete metaphors. So when you physically look up, there has been studies done or experiments conducted where people do associate literally looking up with figuratively looking up. Yeah,
that's so interesting. I think resilience is such an interesting thing to think about because it sort of contains in it this idea of like being able to bounce back, being able to go back to some existing state, but it also has this sort of other idea of that maybe you could go beyond that and bounce into something really new and transformational. And it feels like we're kind of at that moment right now where are we going to bounce back to how things were, or are we going to, take this moment and move into something hopefully much better for all. And maybe thinking about that and sort of ideas around the political landscape and democracy, maybe we can go back for 1 minute to you, Leah, and ask you to tell us about your couple of cake projects that you have going on here. This is Dime for Democracy, and then we also have an image from protest cakes.
Yes, so I, in my former life, earlier life in San Francisco after grad school, I worked at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art for a company called Blue Bottle, who had a rooftop cafe. And I worked with Caitlin Freeman and Tess Wilson making pastries based on artworks in the rotating museum exhibitions. And so we were always making sort of like, one of the things that we would say in the kitchen is like, make a cake about it. And it, and it also started, my thesis was on the artistic possibilities of cake. And so it sort of started there, but I think I became more interested in it as a form the more I got, how it almost became my studio, that little kitchen, and the concepts were taking shape in these edible things, and I think it was also a way of me honoring artists who had come before and collaborating with the museum in a different way to, like engage the visitors on another level. So there's a lot of, one of my favorite things to do in the museum was to watch people look at the art and take it in. And I think that there's been another way of consuming literally the artwork, and it was never done to like as a twee or to make fun of the art. It was really as an homage to these artworks. And so, while we did do a Mondrian cake that was pretty literal, we also did a little bit more nuanced desserts that were sort of a point of education, I think, for people and lesser known artists to sort of expose them to people's palettes. And I think there is something I won't go on too much, but like people go to museums to sit in front of a Roscoe, like they'll travel far and wide. And then they leave having fulfilled that and had some kind of experience sitting in front of that. And that's, I think, what we try to do with these desserts is make it even like even more memorable. So the museum closed when the cafe closed when the museum closed for an expansion, and we didn't reopen, and Tess moved away, and we sort of moved on. I continued to make cakes more as kind of vehicles for color. But once the 2016 election happened, Tess was coming for a visit and she wanted to do something, and she had flown in the day of the Muslim ban. At the airport, people were protesting, and she came up with this idea of protest cakes. And so that was really a way of, I mean, I was raised in Canada and had a lot of catching up to do in terms of what was going on and sort of, it was all overwhelming. It is all overwhelming. And I think that like what Christine was saying, it's one thing that we can do. And I think I would be able to focus if I knew it was all going towards being expressed in a cake. I had sort of a focus and could use it as a way of learning about certain things I didn't know. And it also provided an opportunity for Tess and I to be in touch daily. We were making about a cake a day based on how quickly the news was coming out. And in some cases it was to either raise money for things, or I would literally deliver the cakes to the cause that we were making the cake about, or take it to protests, that sort of thing, to share. And that became a lot on top of other projects. And so I stepped back in 2018, and Tess continued to keep it on an Instagram account and keep up with the news. And I was trying to keep up with the news. I just couldn't make a cake about it every day. So, but then 4 years later, Dine for Democracy, because of the situation, usually collaborates with restaurants. They were raising money for 6 months leading up to the election for voting rights. And so I reached out to Lena, who I know as an artist, local artist, and said I could make a cake, the same cake, a month. And then every month would be a different cake with a different significance. And this was also an opportunity for me to make something pretty. I think sometimes with the protest cakes, it really had to, sometimes it wasn't pretty, like it couldn't be pretty. And this was sort of putting hope back in, and also seeing as like, you know, I don't want to go out unnecessarily to grocery stores or order things that I don't need. So I was really trying to use what I had or what was in season, so pulling from the garden or a neighbor's garden, and really thinking about how these cakes could teach people, but also soothe people, and that the reminder that there are things to celebrate, and that food is a necessary thing and like a really common thing we were all experiencing. So yeah, that's what those are. Yeah.
And we see a reference to Susan's work in one of those cakes, right? We've got a timer for her project 1 Minute Smile, which we're hoping we will do right at the end of the conversation today.
Yeah, that one you have to turn the cake upside down for it to, I'm just kidding. But it is like that. Speaking of mindfulness, it's like before you cut into the cake, it's let's just take a moment together. And yeah,
it's great. So finally today, I'd like to turn to Christine, to your recent billboard project. How do you keep your heart open in Omaha, Nebraska? And I'd love it if you could tell us about this project, but then also if we could use our remaining time to have a bit of a conversation about this really important question that you are posing, which feels so resonant at this moment.
Thank you. So For Freedoms, again, asked me to contribute a billboard design. This is for their 50 state plus Commonwealth project in the lead up to the election. It ran from Indigenous Peoples Day through the election day. And each billboard had a question. And this is my question. For me, it's a central question in my art practice, but I think also in terms of like politics and political divides and asking people in this moment what they stand for, this is also like a real relevant question. For me, like this question touches not only about artistic practice and emotional vulnerability, but also about like, you know, the social contract that you mentioned, Donna, that what is our responsibility to each other, and how do we keep welcoming new people who are different than us, and how do we embrace a mindset of abundance rather than scarcity, and of generosity rather than self-preservation?
Yeah, such an important question for us to really think deeply about now. And I'm wondering, Leah, how you respond to that question and how you think about it in your work.
Yeah, I think just recognizing that everybody has a story, and I want to, I don't know, I think empathy is a big thing right now for me, and just really as impossible as it is, to try to listen to things that might not be what you agree with. And I think really, I think it's just, it's too bad. I don't know. I mean, I think I watched the Yo-Yo Ma interview that brought up this billboard, and he said that your heart is a muscle, and in order to strengthen a muscle, you know, it's the one muscle that kind of works on its own, but you also have to use it, right, in order to strengthen it. And I hate to think that like more people are needing to do that because of the tragedy, like that we need a tragedy in order to think like, oh, maybe we need to open our heart more, that it can't be sort of, I don't know, ever since this billboard, I feel like I wake up and my feet hit the floor and I think about this. And so I can only imagine people passing it and how it might impact them in ways they might not even know. So I think, and in thinking about what Yo-Yo Ma said, to just, you know, maybe the practicing or strengthening that muscle is just saying this question and what does that mean? I don't know. It used to mean like smiling at 6 people in the morning before I had coffee, but now no one.
No one can see your smile under your mask.
Yeah.
It definitely, I mean, it's sort of like a process, right? Every day you get up and you try to do that again. And I think that was something you were thinking, Christine, with the aesthetic approach you took to the piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So normally when I do like calligraphy, for like with the Times Square billboards, I will like draw it in pencil maybe, and then scan, and then ink it with calligraphy pen, and then scan it, and then in Photoshop I like take out all the mistakes. And then this one I really wanted to emphasize, like, by making it a graphite drawing, and I actually physically cut up the paper to fix the spacing, and just letting the lines be and not having to erase everything that's like an errant mark. Just like understanding like this question of how do you keep your heart open, there is no like one and done. It's not like your heart is going to be open when you've like achieved this one. You don't unlock this level. It's a thing that you constantly do. And that's what I was trying to mirror in like how I made the drawing. It's like everything is a process. And I think like perfectionism has a lot of flaws where it can be like antithetical to like growing and taking chances, and like I keep saying, being vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, it poses other questions, right? It's sort of like, how do we see our common humanity in one another? And it's been making me think, and this might seem like a strange connection, but I've been thinking about this 1966 lunar orbiter shot of the Earth from the moon, and this idea of like the overview effect that astronauts experienced when they had that perspective, which would just shift their thinking completely, and suddenly they would see themselves and other people in a completely different relationship, and so much more interconnected. And it's kind of like, how do we get to that like overview perspective without having to launch ourselves up into space? Like, how do we manage to see ourselves in each other? And part of that is just keep asking these questions and keep having to think about the answers. So thank you for keep asking the important questions. So unless you have some other comments you'd like to make about this, it might be time now we can invite Kelly to come back, and I'm sure we have some questions from our audience that it would be great to have some time to explore together. Hi, Kelly.
It's so incredible. Thank you both for all of your work. We have some questions, and Christine was posting some text she's been reading in the chat. It may be Roth Gay's text we should post as well on Delight. So if I could ask somebody to do that. There was a question early on by somebody, I think, Leah, you were talking about kind of the struggle creating work. And, you know, for me, I've written down the depth of empathy, you know, the gratitude, generosity, delight, joy, all of this that both of you think about so deeply as you're creating work and thinking about your audience. But that struggle of how you're going to reach your audience. And then as you were going into talking about color, the question came up, which I'm sure you've heard before. What about people who are blind? What about people who don't see color? And how do you begin kind of considering other people, or maybe because art is such a, you know, such a sensory kind of thing, it's just, that's not possible. And I wonder if you could speak to that, both of you maybe.
Yeah, it's definitely something I've given a lot of thought to, and actually like experienced, and you know, especially thinking about how do I make this thing for everybody everywhere. And during installation where I was painting a wall at a large office space, there was a visually impaired employee who needed a walk to the dining hall thing. And I walked him and he said, "Oh, are you the artist?" And he could smell the paint like as we left. And I thought to myself, and he said, so what are you doing? And I explained it to him and how the colors were taken from moments that you encounter. And I thought, oh, this is not for everybody. Like I have to do, that's where the language started to come in a little bit more. And I started making playlists for each of the colored installations that take me probably sometimes more time than the installation themselves, just because I do think that there is sort of this like feeling I want to get. And so for me to have that, and I think I was in residence at the McCall Center in Charlotte, and a Canadian artist named Carmen Papalia was also in residence, and he did not like the term blind because it's defined in the dictionary is that you're sort of like unintellectual and that you don't see it, like it's over your head. And he didn't like that, so he was really he would go by non-visual learner, and his focus was really on, I had lots of conversations with him because that was a concern of mine. But part of the exhibition was this color bar, which was small snacks that were based on the color. And so there was this element of taste that he felt like he was getting it, you know, like he was getting something out of it through this. And then it was so much more about, the problem was so much more than about not seeing. It was about actually general accessibility in public spaces and institutions. And that can be language, it can be sites, it can be, you know, all sorts of things, not having a proper ramp. And so that has been sort of really, that was yeah, became more than that to me. And yeah.
That's great. And Christine, I wonder if and how you think about this accessibility in your work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Leah and I, we went to California College for arts together. That's how we met. And that was like, as a fine arts are highly associated with visual arts. And I think we're expanding our practices. So there are more ways for audiences and participants to engage with our works than people who are strictly visual artists, I would say. But, I think it's hard to get away from when you're working with color, or when we're working with a flag that's going to be on a flagpole 30 feet away from the ground, like how to share aesthetic moments with people. But I also, for me, like what I'm most interested in this part as aesthetics is aesthetic experience, which isn't necessarily the object. It could be a relationship, and sometimes the object is what gives the aesthetic experience, but sometimes it's a relationship. And I think with Leah's work, it's so multisensory with cakes, it's taste and smell. And then also I'm thinking also about Leah and Susan's collaboration at Yerba Buena Center that involved an audio tour. And I think you don't have to be able to see a color or to experience colors. I think through words and audio, you can have these other ways of accessing that kind of work.
Thank you. There was another question, and maybe Leah, you could just briefly respond to it because I know you probably could write texts on this. And that was, do you think there is maybe a certain color that, hang on a second. Do you think, I'm sorry.
It is about well-being. I saw that question.
Yeah. it was, do you think that well-being can be enhanced more by particular colors?
I guess it depends on who you are. I mean, it is said that, and Christine, you can prove me wrong, but that if you look at a color green, even if you keep it on your screensaver on your phone, or you rip a page of a tree out of a magazine and you pin it on your wall and you look at that more frequently, that you will become more content and calm. So I think, you know, there's a whole, psychology to colors, that like you paint your room bright yellow and you find yourself arguing more. But I think it just sort of like that's where I want to really dive more into where color comes up in literature and music and different traditions, is that it just depends on who you are, what that color can do, because it does one thing here and it does another thing in India, and it does another thing in, you know, all over the different significances, colors. So different names for different colors, even less names for colors. So, I mean, I believe that color has a power to enhance a place and engage people, but I that's just my perspective, my hope.
That's great. As you were talking about kind of self-care and how you go about, I mean, being quite involved with you, Leah, and the creation of the multivitamin work, like a multivitamin, there were moments where you struggled. I mean, and it is so much work, and both of you, empathy is so deeply, in many ways, from my perspective, what's motivated you and your work. This idea of generosity, creating joy, creating delight, you know, expressing gratitude, and how each of you care for yourself. And I ask because it's something that I know Montalvo is very interested in right now, and how artists are thinking about their self-care. But we had a conversation recently where we had an artist say, you know, if we're not caring for our communities, self-care is kind of meaningless. So the two are very connected. One begets the other, and vice versa. And I wonder if you would both just speak about that a little bit. Or not. You have full permission to just refuse.
I mean, it's you know, I've been studying positive psychology for the past 10 years, and continually it's a process of like trying to apply what I'm learning to myself as I'm making this work. And I think like this week I had a realization of like, there are like 13-year-olds who are telling me about their coping skills through these resilience flag designs, and I need to be paying attention and like also learning from them and like applying it to myself, so that I'm like trying not to like beat myself up, because when I look at something, all I see are the flaws, and being too much of a perfectionist and not understanding like the process, and being too impatient with like when like I'm learning something new, and like recognizing that mindfulness too is a practice, and that just becoming more aware of something is progress, even if I can't all of a sudden change my behavior towards like these idealized things in my mind. So that for sure is like a way that like my work is helping me to become more self-aware and more like balanced, and care for myself that way through this knowledge that I'm gaining through books and researchers, as well as participants and what they're sharing with me.
I love that. And I think the whole color collecting sort of process evolved or came into being because of that very thing. I was, I think having a job, being expected to be somewhere and making these cakes and getting immediate feedback, and always sort of trying something new was so just fed me so much. And then when that was gone, I started to say, like, how am I gonna make anything if someone's not on the other side of the counter? And so I think the color collecting ended up starting just because I liked running and being active and being outside. And so it was a way for me to actually do some of the work while doing my thing that made me feel like less anxious. And then I think with everything, the struggle comes when you start thinking too much about, well, when I start thinking too much about what this is supposed to do, and then almost running out of ideas because there's too many like palettes, or you're limited by, in some cases I'm not able to pick the paint colors. I'm limited to, let's say, the vinyl colors, and budget and different, in terms of the public pieces now, especially, there is a new way of thinking about public space. And I hope that it was almost like it could happen because of the pandemic, because now there were sort of conceptual things that were really important to me, that are now being considered because of the limitations. I don't know if that makes sense, but almost using art as the way to suggest to people, like, this is how far apart you should be. No one wants to be told one more time, but I think if art can kind of do that thing that suggests ways of interacting, I think that there is a new kind of hope for that. But yeah, I mean, I do struggle because sometimes I don't know what to do, and I think so much more when I'm in the space and when I'm in it, like when I'm actually like in the process of making it, then more things start to happen. And I think I just get really stifled sometimes with trying to make it look like how I want it to, when I also want a little bit of freedom to do things in the moment, which is where the magic happens. But it's really hard to convince people, like, trust me. But luckily, that's why, I mean, like, when I work with you at Montalvo, and with there are people who understand that and pursue the work with you, and I think that and I think in these projects, like, I am not on, even though I am like executing, sometimes it's like there's so many people who I feel like I get to work with that make it all look better because of their support. So yeah.
It's part of that community care, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's one last question, and I think we need to be rather brief. I'm sorry. And that is from Christy Chan, who says hello to you both. And Christy's asking, she's curious how your environments, your physical and geographic spaces, affect your engagement with your art practices and your relationship to wellness. Being in a city, being in San Francisco, being in New York.
I mean, I think there's so many ways I could answer this question, and I think like the easy way is just to talk about like the physical constraints of like having to deal with like very expensive real estate in New York has like definitely changed my work, where I'm much more inclined to make smaller work and more mobile work. But it's also like work is also tends to be more easily distributed to audiences. So that's totally fine with me. I think that question about like wellness is a really interesting one. It's hard for me to answer because it's hard for me to separate, I think, wellness in my own personal life and like wellness as I study it in my art practice. And I think where this is making me think is just about like capitalism. You know, like San Francisco is just as, if not more expensive than New York City. And when I think about the amount of like time and like resources it takes to like develop an artistic voice and practice, and how much room for wasting materials and like failure and like going down like dead ends and coming back and you know, continuing on like with other experiments and not being afraid to like be wasting time or materials. I don't know if I've ever like really had that for an extended period of time, you know, like I've been able to give myself through my own like mentality about like how I deal with my self-worth, or through just like my feeling of like just how much I've internalized capitalism.
Mm.
Do you want to respond, Leah?
Oh, I don't know if we had time. I think my big lesson was just making work while at Recology and finding my own personal garbage from a year and a half prior, and just recognizing that like the things that we make as artists, how much space they take up in the world, and that really impacted everything I made since, and just trying to, in sort of how to be generous without sort of giving one more thing that might end up in the gutter in a year's time, to make something that is beautiful and lasting, but that doesn't create extra. And I think that can also be in the food we make, the ingredients we acquire, the materials we acquire to make work, and yeah. So I think that, I don't even know if that answered the question, but.
I want the Recology story, but people are going to have to look it up.
Yeah,
yeah.
And find that for themselves. Well, I want to thank you both so much for joining us today. It is always a pleasure, and it's been a pleasure today to share time with you. This is our last scratch space for this year, and we're going to be returning in January with some new content that we're excited to share. And so, Kelly, perhaps you can tell us what we have coming up next year.
Absolutely. And I just want to join Donna. We'll do one thing after I'm done, but I just want to thank you both, because you do incredible work, and you need to just, you know, take stock in that. You're adding to this world, and we appreciate you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this invitation. Thank you for holding this space, and thank you for supporting artists through the residency program.
We're honored. So this is our last scratch space of 2020, and I think just a perfect place to leave us sort of with the questions that hang in the air. We'll resume Scratch Space on the 21st of January, and we'll be joined by Stephanie Dinkins, and she's an artist and scholar working in AI, along with the digital media theorist and artist Jason Lewis. And together we'll explore the future and what a future with AI looks like, and how it contributes to the flourishing of all humans and non-humans. We'll be exploring how we co-create more equitable values grounded in artificial intelligence ecosystems. How can we broaden discussions regarding the role of technologies in society beyond the large culturally homogeneous research labs that we find today in Silicon Valley startup culture? And then on the 28th of January, we'll be joined by disabled activist media maker and consultant Alice Wong, who will discuss her work as the founder and director of the Disability Visibility Project and her recently edited book, Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century. Visual artist Jason Lazarus and Sebrin Viersteg will describe their recent project, Public Address, a nationwide virtual protest in support of the Black Lives Matter movement that prioritizes the civic engagement of individuals who are immunocompromised and their caregivers, people with disabilities, and precarious community members. We'll be exploring how we can widen the possibilities for political participation, activism, and access and visibility for historically marginalized communities. And we'll dream a just future for all into being and consider how we can embody access as an act of love.
So we're very excited about sharing that new content with you and continuing to have conversations like this on the platform of Scratch Space. We would like to end today by inviting you to participate in Susan's 1 minute smile. So I'm going to share the screen here. This was a performance that Susan premiered at Montalvo. And I think it will give us something very special to take away with us today.
Okay, everybody has to test a minute.